Let me just press that.
This one. Okay, thank you.
It hurts my military instincts that we're already late. But I blame the senator, so that's all right. Like all good military men, I always look for a politician to blame. Anyway, good afternoon. It's a great privilege to chair such a distinguished panel that includes three good friends in Generals Bartels and Lawson. I think we're good friends. Tom and I are not so certain about General Bartels. And Nigel Inkster, who's a colleague of mine within IISS. Colonel Liu from China, and Senator McCain, who needs no introduction. I would say, in the case of the senator, he was always a very gracious host to me, and I'm sure others, on my visits to Washington, and his views invariably sharpened my own, so it was always a tonic to come and visit you. Colonel Yu Lin, we reckon, is going to be the youngest general in the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and you asked a very probing question yesterday that people admired, so it's great to have you here in particular. So welcome to the panel. The topic is carefully chosen. Specifically talks, if I may remind you, of new terrorist threats. Now, I rather unilaterally have decided that this should obviously include the actions and threats of non-state actors, but also perhaps state-sponsored, for want of a better term, terrorism, loosely defined, to include what is increasingly described as, shall we say, hybrid warfare. No other panel has such a remit, and I thought it would be remiss if we didn't allow our panellists, and indeed you, to explore some of the implications of hybrid operations. This will enable you to explore the need, which is the real point of this panel, for armed forces to manoeuvre in things like social media, cyberspace, for example, in order properly to manage and defeat new ways of war, let alone the need to operate confidently in the conventional media space, something which we're not nearly good enough at, and which many of our opponents are much better at. The second point I'd like to make by way of introduction is the need to properly understand one's enemy or opponent. Is ISIS, and it came up today, for example, a terrorist organisation as it's often described, less so as we mutually educate ourselves better, or really a conventional enemy? It holds ground, administers territory, etc., that employs what could be termed terrorist tactics, and is a very important distinction to draw when deciding how one's going to combat it. The other thing is, I raised myself in the question in the last plenary, some of you might like to grapple with this idea that we've got time. You know, a lot of people talk about this as a generational struggle. For what it's worth, I don't share that view, and I suspect many of you don't. We haven't got forever. Every moment you give an organisation like ISIS, they're consolidating, they're drawing in support, and they're becoming somehow more established. This is very dangerous indeed. So the issue of time is perhaps something else I'd like you to get at. The aim of this session is to examine whether our armed forces and the alliances of which they are almost all invariably members are up to the challenges posed by terrorist threats in all their different guises. And I think there's a presupposition that they're not yet ready for it, despite the experience that we've got of dealing with it. Are we really up for it and able to do it, while still contending, as people rightly reminded us today, with more conventional threats? Because it isn't an either-or. You've got to manage the lot if you're going to be successful. So with that as by way of an introduction, I'm going to go from right to left. We'll hear what the panellists say, and then I'll open it up. We'll probably ask make a number of points collectively in order to get as many of you through as possible. Knud, could I ask you to start?
Thank you very much. And indeed, as the chairman of the panel said, he and I have been friends once. I still hope it's not beyond a point of breaking. We might still be friends again. Well, thank you very much, David, for giving me the floor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Straight to the point, the title is Armed Forces and New Terrorist Threats. My views are, needless to say, to a certain extent reflecting the decisions which were made at the summit in September in Wales by the NATO heads of state and government. Here, indeed, under the impulse not only of events in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East, North Africa, the alliance, in fact, started what I would call a military strategic repositioning of its armed forces, and which, of course, is an enduring process which doesn't take place overnight. This choice, which was made by the alliance, reflects to a large extent the speed and the substance of the changing challenges we are facing. Nobody predicted in 1st of January 2011 that we would have an air campaign in Libya. Nobody predicted last year on the 1st of January that Crimea would become Russian. And this year nobody predicted that we would have Yemen to a large extent imploding. And what we are facing is not only the classic state versus state conflict, we are also facing the state-like versus the state. The chairman of the panel alluded to it as to Daesh, ISIL, or the non-state versus state conflicts of one kind or another. Common to all potential or ongoing conflicts are a number of dimensions which I think are fundamental to our approaches. The first one is intelligence. Not only in the sense of gathering intelligence, hard intelligence as to who you are facing, be it opponents or enemy, but also in the broader sense of the word to understand what you are facing, be it from an historical perspective, a geographical perspective, a religious perspective, cultural, economic, and so on. The second point I would like to highlight is the ability to act and react. I'm talking as a soldier. And here the command and control at the political and the military level becomes absolutely essential. And needless to say, when you're talking about coalitions or alliances, there's always a dimension of complexity to that. My third point is the forces available to conduct operations of one kind or another. We need forces which are able to conduct full spectrum operations. Not only that, they must be adaptable and flexible at very short notice. And finally, not to be forgotten, they must be deployable. My final point as to what is absolutely necessary is a comprehensive approach. I think all military people agree to a large extent that military solutions seldom exist on their own, particularly when you conduct operations against terrorist threats of one kind or another. All other dimensions of state power, international organizations, societies need to be brought together, aiming at achieving a decisive strategic effect. I would just like to highlight what has happened with piracy off the coast of Somalia. Piracy was a symptom. The real issue was imploding Somalia. And it's only by having the African Union, the European Union, some of the neighbors of Somalia getting together and beginning to bring together more or less a United Nations, not to be forgotten, and to bring together a plan to move ahead with Somalia, that we see progress taking place. Otherwise, we have only been dealing with the symptom. How to do it? We have had quite some reflections on this issue in NATO. And I think there are a balance of three different types of military approaches which we need to take into consideration. The first one is deterrence, which brings us back to a rather classic perspective. The second one is containment, maybe a bit, shall we say, in the vein of George Kennan's famous approach to the Soviet Union back at the beginning of the Cold War. And the third one is protection. Deterrence, to come back to that first, is primarily aiming at the state versus state dimension, but not exclusively, particularly when we talk about the state-like dimension, of which we might discuss, or which was alluded to as Daesh and so on. Containment probably addresses to a larger extent shall we say, conflicts which are not state to state. And there is a need to be able to contain the expansion of the conflicts, particularly as we see them from the Middle East for the time being, and also in certain parts of the African continent. And finally, protection. protection in the broadest sense of the word of our populations, vital infrastructures, lines of communication, the so-called global commons, and so on. All those three dimensions will have to be pulled together if we are to address, within, shall we say, a comprehensive approach, if we are to address the issues facing us from a military perspective. And to do this, we will have to continue to adapt our forces and to keep up with the challenges. We cannot stay static in the organisation, development, and preparation of our forces. And we must not believe that preparing for the last war, such as counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, will leave us ready to face the next challenge. Not at all, quite the opposite, I would say. And we should not exclusively concentrate on one dimension of warfare. We have to be able to keep up with all dimensions of warfare, and that's why I mentioned the full spectrum of operations as to our forces. Bottom line, our armed forces must be ready to adapt to all types of battlefields, also the ones we haven't predicted, and they are the most probable one. Thank you.
Thanks, Knud. And of course, some of you might like to ask Knud, as chairman of the NATO Military Committee, whether he thinks NATO's forces are that capable. I've got my own view. Nigel Inkster, whose expertise is particularly in this area. Nigel.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. I think I'm the only person on this panel who's never actually worn a uniform, but notwithstanding that fact, I seem to have done quite a lot of war fighting during the course of my career. But I thought what I might usefully do is spend a few minutes on what we think new forms of terrorism actually might be, and very briefly, look at some of the key differences between what we've been dealing with for the last decade plus what we're dealing with now and what the implications of that are. If we look at Al-Qaeda, as we came to know it, operating out of Afghanistan and Pakistan, what were the key characteristics of this organization? It was universalist. It aspired, to be relevant and to function, anywhere in the world. It started with a defensive mindset. The idea was that Al-Qaeda was there to protect and defend an Islamic community, an ummah that was under threat. It had a focus on the far enemy, the United States of America and its allies, whose support was critical to the sustainment of the so-called apostate regimes of the Islamic world that ultimately were Al-Qaeda's target. It was actually quite non-territorial, particularly after the loss of of control of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda's approach to the establishment of a caliphate, to the taking and holding of territory, felt at times almost metaphysical, not really very, very focused and connected. And in terms of approaches, it had an almost autistic obsession with replicating the kind of mass casualty, mass effect attacks that we saw epitomized by 9/11. What's different about Islamic State? Well, firstly, Islamic State is a phenomenon that comes about as a result of religious fanaticism combined with very, very rigorous and focused Ba'athist organizational skills. So it's a lot of different things. It's a terrorist organization. It's a millenarian sect. It is an army, and it is an entity that purports to hold and administer territories. It's lots of different things. But it is essentially local. It's about occupying a certain area of territory and holding that. It operates from a much more offensive perspective. IS does not have this sense that it is, operating under duress and under threat. It is taking the war to the enemy. It is, very offensive, and it's focused on the near enemy, the countries of the region. It is, of course, entirely territorial. Its approach to the undertaking of terrorist attacks is rather different from Al-Qaeda because it encourages and supports a much more diverse repertoire. Anything from the Nike approach to terrorism, the sort of just do it, take a knife and behead the next person who passes by, right through to more focused, orchestrated and planned attacks, which we're now starting to see more evidence of. And the other thing that I think distinguishes Islamic State from the ideological perspective, is this very strong sense of eschatology, this idea that the end of days is coming and it is the duty of Islamic State to actually facilitate the arrival of the end of days. Now, this kind of millenarian eschatological phenomenon is nothing new. It's been around pretty much since human beings started walking upright on the planet. But, of course, it does have implications, because if you think that the end of the world's coming and it's your job to facilitate that, self-evidently any constraints that you might otherwise have perceived simply go out of the window and mean that you're dealing with an organisation that is not going to constrain itself in terms of what it does. What we're dealing with here, the challenges are the challenges of territorial occupation that we're seeing in Iraq and Syria, combined with the transnational facet of Islamic State. It's quite clear that for Islamic State leadership, the new front is Libya. We're seeing a lot of focus on Libya. Some of the top IS leaders have now transferred to Libya. A lot of training is taking place there, and we can expect this mobility to continue to manifest itself, which makes it a difficult phenomenon to keep track of, and it's very variegated in the way that it presents itself. As with any terrorist phenomenon, I think the role of militaries is going to be determined by very specific circumstances. There is not a one-size-fits-all approach, I do not think. I think there are some situations in which the involvement of armed forces in counter-terrorism, counter-insurgency operations is essential, at the very least, to avert the possibility of failure, but also to stabilise the situation for longer term. There will be other situations where I think the role of the military is going to be very limited, borderline non-existent, and it's going to be more a function of civilian intelligence and security agencies and law enforcement agencies. And that is going to be determined by the specific circumstances in which this new phenomenon manifests itself. There's a lot more I could talk about, but I've overrun my time, so I'll end it there.
Well, thank you very much. As ever, very educational. You can tell he's a civilian. He uses terms like metaphysical and eschatology, or something like that. And so I'm better educated. I'm sure you all are.
For the benefit of the interpreters, that one I think is more Lun in Chinese and something similar.
Now you're really getting into BS territory. Thanks, Nigel. Tom Lawson, who's the Chief of Defence Forces from Canada. Tom.
Thanks very much, David. And Nigel, if it's bothering you that you've never worn a uniform, Canada is recruiting, and there's still time. Ladies and gentlemen, each of these esteemed panel members is unique in his or her own ways. My uniqueness, I suppose, if I have any, comes from the fact that I come from Canada, probably the only Pacific nation that has polar bears, which is a different type of terror, but certainly not a new one, so not germane. I'm also currently a Chief of Defence, therefore frequently awake at night considering this very topic of interest this afternoon, or if others are staying awake because of this, at least I'm getting paid for it. My remarks will primarily address, from a Canadian point of view, the armed forces and the role in facing the new terrorist threat. Several points on that topic. First, where the armed forces may have the lead. Second, where the armed forces are expected to support others who have the lead. And regardless of those first two, the importance of developing and strengthening the security, defense, intelligence weave that will address these threats. Now, I think it's fair to say that regarding the new terrorist threats and knowing them, as Knud was talking about, not too many things are clear, but a few things might be. First, I think it's clear enough that the scourge of terrorism is a global issue. Countries that are untouched by this phenomenon are becoming increasingly rare, and Canada was also attacked last October with the deliberate murders of a couple of Canadian Armed Forces personnel. In fact, the death toll would have been far worse if the gunmen who entered Parliament hadn't have been dealt with so quickly by the security personnel there. And, of course, Canadians, like all nations, peoples, continue to watch alongside the rest of the world with deepening horror, the barbarism of ISIS-Daesh in Syria and Iraq. Next, I know terrorism is very much an increasing concern here in the region, and our government faces many of the same questions and problems as the governments right in here, some of which are rather philosophical, such as how do we balance our people's need for security with their desire for freedoms? Second, how do we identify and address the core causes of terrorism? And I won't go too far on that. But from a defense perspective, as I said earlier, it's the job of people like me to be concerned with the military facet of such problems. So more to the point, how do we incorporate counterterrorism and counterinsurgency techniques more comprehensively into our military doctrine? How do we train and equip our people to deal with the multifaceted and constantly evolving battle spaces like this one? How do we apply lessons learned and best practices to our future operations? And on the military diplomacy front, how do we build effective international relationships in order to address the transnational nature of many of these terrorist threats? Finally, how do we build an effective safety net between law enforcement, military, and intelligence services? And this last point speaks directly to the question regarding the role of armed forces vis-à-vis terrorist threats. And I should make clear from the outset that in Canada, responsibility for counterterrorism resides with the Department of Public Safety, not Defence. It's very much the responsibility of our police forces, as well as our domestic security and intelligence services on our soil. So domestically, Canadian Armed Forces only acts at the request of civil authorities with capabilities that, for example, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police simply don't have and they need from us. For this purpose, the Canadian Special Operations Forces maintain a high readiness cadre able to deliver both strategic and precision effect if and when required on very short notice. Hostage rescue, immediate armed counter-terrorism response, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear response. However, when we talk about combating terrorism outside our borders, which is kind of where we've driven to with the panel here, then the Canadian Armed Forces does take the operational lead as part of broader government efforts. Primary example at present is our role in the multinational coalition against Daesh in Iraq and Syria. 600 personnel in the area have conducted 1,000 sorties in the coalition's air campaign, and we have special operations forces on the ground working with local forces in an advise and assist role. In recent years, Canada has also played a significant role in countering marine terrorism, the coalition that promotes security and stability in international waters off the Middle East by denying terrorist organizations from using the high seas for smuggling weapons, illicit cargo, narcotics to fund their illegal activities. And we do similar work closer to our shores in the Caribbean Sea alongside the Americans and in the Eastern Pacific Ocean. And we do all this collaboratively with our network of allies and partners across the world. Our Special Operations Forces in particular have created some really strong relationships in many countries, specifically here in the Asia-Pacific with the Philippines and Malaysia. The more general point is that by building and developing these connections and trust with allies and partners, we go a long way to developing the deep relationships across the security, defense, intelligence nexus that's integral to successful counterterrorism efforts. For me and the people under my command, the key focus when thinking about security and intelligence functions is getting the most timely and valuable strategic support. That's information, not only in the execution of operations, but also in the planning. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll close by saying that terrorism creates enormous challenges for the international system as global trends increasingly have local effects and vice versa. The application of military force is clearly an important instrument in confronting and defeating terrorist threats, and it's incumbent upon military professionals to be aware not only of the tactical realities during operations, but also to maintain an awareness of the wider strategic environment, understanding that to truly defeat terrorism is not only a military challenge, but fundamentally a political one. And I'll stop here. David.
Tom, thank you very much indeed. Excellent. Colonel Liu, over to you, please.
Okay.
Professor.
Thank you, David. Actually, I'm still a learner in this field. I have been thinking some basic issues in this field. What's the definition of new terrorist threat? How to deal with it with so many different understandings on this issue. Here, I would like to share with you 3 of my basic observations. First, terrorist and violent and violent extremism have become common enemies of the international community and also show its new features. Since the year of 2014, we have seen the expansion of international terrorist activities. We have seen the spread of ISIS activities in the Middle East, the strong revival of terrorist activities in South Asia, the frequent terrorist activities in Africa, the re-emergence of terrorist activities in Southeast Asia, and the worsening of security situation due to terrorism in Central Asia. Now, international terrorism has entered a new phase of fast development, and new terrorist threats are gradually in shape. And international efforts to combat terrorism are facing severe challenges. It was once the common view that the death of bin Laden and other al-Qaeda leaders in 2011 signified the beginning of the downfall of international terrorism. But in 2014, ISIS took over to become the new front. The new features of international terrorist threats can be summarized as follows. First, more extreme or brutal actions resulting in increasing casualties of ordinary people. Second, with the aim of establishing a new country by resorting to violent terrorist measures. Third, foreign jihads going back home and creating troubles in the United States and European countries. Fourth, more lone wolf attacks as a result of extreme ideology. My second observation, China is the victim of international terrorism and violent extremism. China has long been suffering from the East Turkestan terrorist groups. The separatist and terrorist groups in Xinjiang and extreme religious extremists, etc. And these groups have also conducted a lot of terrorist incidents in Central Asia countries. For example, in the year of 2014, several serious terrorist incidents occurred in China, causing 80 deaths and over 300 casualties. Meanwhile, China is an active participant in combating international terrorism. China shares the same positions and concerns of the other countries that are also threatened by terrorism. China attaches great importance to regional and international counterterrorism cooperation, including that under the UN framework. China has joined a total number of 11 international counterterrorism treaties. In recent years, a lot of joint training activities or exercises have been conducted between China and the foreign countries, with quite a number of them using counterterrorism as a background. Moreover, China's counterterrorism efforts, while forming an important part of international counterterrorism efforts, receives forceful support from the international society. For example, the UN Security Council has officially put the East Turkestan movement in its list of terrorist organizations. Meanwhile, the Chinese government is keeping a close watch on the tendencies of East Turkestan terrorists to join ISIS. Third, to enhance international counterterrorism cooperation, it is desirable to abandon double standards and deal with both the roots and the symptoms of terrorism. On the one hand, it is desirable to abandon double standards. To deal with new terrorist threats, we need to strengthen international counterterrorism cooperation, but international counterterrorism cooperation should be based on the respect for basic norms of international relations and give full play to the role of the United Nations. China is willing to conduct international counterterrorism cooperation with other countries on the basis of mutual respect and equality, but is firmly opposed in imposing double standard on the issue of counterterrorism. On the other, one should not link counterterrorism to any particular country, religion, or civilization. Otherwise, there could be a situation of the more counterterrorism measures, the more terrorist activities. On the other hand, to deal with new terrorist threats, one should address both the roots and the symptoms of terrorism and make long-term efforts to deal with the roots of terrorism, including poverty, violent culture, extremist thoughts, and poor governance, etc. Let me stop here with my quotation with David. The struggle against international terrorism and violent extremists will be a generational struggle. Thank you.
Yes, good point, well made. The point I was making this morning was it may be generational, but it better be a short generation. We haven't got forever, but we agree. Thank you very much. Excellent again. And Senator, by no means least, you please, sir.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. And before maybe we look forward, maybe it might be well to review the events of the last recent days. ISIS, you can call them Daesh or ISIL. ISIS has had two very significant victories. One, Ramadi, the capital of the Sunni Anbar province, a place where during the surge we lost hundreds of American soldiers and Marines killed and wounded as part of the surge, where elements of the Shiite militia that we fought against are now we are going to rely on to retake Ramadi. Reports from Ramadi are house-to-house identification lists, people slaughtered, children massacred, bodies burning in the streets. And then, of course, at roughly the same time, the ancient city of Palmyra in Syria falls to ISIS. Same repetition of ISIS barbarity and slaughter. And added to it, of course, is Palmyra's historical significance of 2,000-year-old antiquities, which, if ISIS holds true to their previous behavior, will be destroyed by ISIS. In response, the United States Secretary of State said, and I quote, it was a, quote, target of opportunity. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States said, well, it's not important because it was not part of the caliphate. Presidential spokesman, Mr. Ernest, said, and I quote, we're not going to have our hair on fire every time we're not going to set our hair on fire every time there's a setback. Well, first, the rise of ISIL is an unprecedented development. To be sure, Islamist extremism is not new to Asia, but we've never seen a terrorist movement like ISIL before. It is a truly global threat. ISIL is radicalizing young people across the region and in nearly every other region of the world, including North America, faster and more extensively than any terrorist movement ever before. The prospect of young people leaving our countries, training and fighting with ISIL, and returning home to conduct terrorist attacks is now likely the most immediate threat that all of us face. This is due in large part to ISIL's continued conquest of territory in the broader Middle East and the failure of the United States and our partners to stop it. That leads to a second point. We need to acknowledge an uncomfortable fact. We are losing. We are losing because we are not winning. ISIL has the momentum on the ground. It is taking territory in Iraq and Syria. It is expanding in Libya and Afghanistan and Egypt and other countries. It continues to attract foreign fighters by the thousands, and the international coalition that is formed to confront ISIL is not succeeding. To be clear, it is not that we're doing nothing. It is that nothing we are doing, diplomatically, economically, or militarily, is reversing ISIL's momentum and putting it on a course for enduring defeat. Finally, America's role in the Middle East is strategically linked to our role in Asia. Some argue that America should disengage from the Middle East in order to pivot to Asia. But why would anyone in Asia be reassured by an America that precipitously abandons its long-standing commitments, allies, and partners in a strategically vital part of the world? What would that say about our capability, credibility, and staying power in Asia? The reality is, superpowers can't pivot. America will be judged in Asia in no small measure by what we do in the Middle East. My friends, if we do not do more to defeat these new terrorist threats, manifested most of all by ISIL, we will not only increase the risk that our peoples and our homelands will be attacked, we will also allow these threats to grow to such an extent that they will crowd out our ability to address the opportunities and challenges in this region, which we all agree is increasingly the center of gravity of the global economy. Thank you.
So thank you very much. As thought-provoking as I remember my visits to your office. Great to see you again, by the way, sir. Right, well, what I'll do now is open it up to the floor. I apologise in advance, I don't pronounce all your names quite right, forgive me. If you want to ask a question, do that, and I will do about 4 or 5 of you at a time. Starting really, yes, Colonel, very good to see you again. With you, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Knud from China. My question goes to McCain. Just as you mentioned, the ISIL has got some significant victories. And also you said we are losing. So my first question is the U.S. going to send ground troops to the Middle East? Because, the facts has improved that only airstriking cannot, finish the job. That is one. And second, because of the losing or not winning, it reminds me of your global terrorist war, which has been going on for over 10 years. So, any lessons or any takeaways I'd like to, if you can share with us from your side. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Gong.
I should say that the speakers have made very good presentations from its respective perspectives. Since we are discussing about the armed forces and the new terrorist threats, first, I think we should realize the new terrorist threats at the moment. There are several very prominent features. First, I should say the Islamic extremists have become very prominent threat, which has a very great magnetic effect or spillover effect, because now more and more young people have been recruited, or I think, especially I can say from China. Many Muslims in Xinjiang have left the country and joined the ISIS. So this is a very serious threat. And the second, I should say, the transnational mobility is growing. And they are moving from one place to another. And this certainly creates more threats to all the countries. And the third, it is all the different extreme groups have end up together. For example, the threat faced by China, not only within China, but also from outside. And this, I think the concluding of this kind of different groups are making more and more serious threats. So what will be the role of the armed forces? Here, I think we have to think of the reality. First, the armed forces is told with a lot of tasks, not only the anti-terrorism. So that's why, in case for China, I think armed forces will not be in the first front. The first front is the police, and the second front for China is the armed police, and the third front of maybe the army. So for the army, I think you mentioned there are several important missions. First, reconnaissance and information gathering. And the second, prevention and control. And the third, of course, training and equipped how to deal with these very specific terrorist threats. Not only all our armed forces will be involved, but some special forces, special operation forces, and ABC forces should be standby, I think, for any eventualities. And another very important point, of course, for international cooperation. And the PLA maybe will be tasked for the counter-terrorist activities, maybe abroad someday in the future. So these are very important things. So for the discussion of this issue, I would like to ask a question that in face of these kind of new threats, so how should the armed forces really adapt to this kind of situation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's important that you, towards the end, you qualified that most of what you were saying was about internal use of armed forces within China or any of our countries as opposed to external. Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Mr. Upside down, it looks rather good. Munir, please. Thank you.
The first one is specifically to Mr. Nigel Inkster. How do you assess the threat from Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent? Because in the South Asian region, it is often said that it is emerging concurrently as important a threat to a new terrorist threat as we see the threat from ISIS. The second question is to the whole panel. There is a significant debate going on right now that we are losing the communications battle against ISIS or Daesh. A lot has been written on it. Every day we see new commentary about it. So what, in your opinion, can be done to stem that tide? How can we enhance our strategic communication so that we don't lose that battle? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ben Barry.
Thanks, General. It seems to me there are some very hard and painful lessons that the United States and its allies learned over the last 15 years or so of war that are directly relevant to this. And if I could just mention a couple of them. The first is the need for a coordination machinery that needs to be geared to strategic, operational and tactical leadership. And there are plenty of examples of suboptimal judgment calls being made over the last 15 years that caused enormous difficulties in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's easy to say the comprehensive approach, the interagency approach, and also linking the military line to intelligence. It's actually devilishly hard to do. And my worry is that as people forget those very hard lessons of the Iraq and Afghan wars, the impetus to keep that approach alive will fade. I think the other question that applies to the military, but it also applies, for example, to paramilitary forces like an unarmed police force, is the calibration of the use of force. Because in an all-out state-on-state conflict, you may use force with less limitations than in a focused operation against terrorists or insurgents. But it is a subject that requires clear thinking, clear judgment, and quite often in these scenarios, less force is going to have more effect in the long term, positive effect, that is.
Yes, it was General Bradley who said after the Second World War, amateurs taught tactics, professionals taught logistics. In my experience of commanding a few operations, I have always agreed with General Bradley, and I can tell you many armies don't get logistics. They do a lot of tactics, and I include in logistics deployability, which one of you mentioned. But more important than logistics is command and control. and getting that right. And I really share Ben's concern that the operational level of war, that gearing, is not well understood. And I give you one example, and that is what's happening in the Middle East and the Gulf at the moment over Yemen. That is the key, not necessarily failing, that is being experienced by the Arab nations as they try to grapple with the Houthi threat. But it's certainly something that they're finding a great difficulty. So thank you for making that point. We'll take one more. Lloyd Parry, please.
Thank you. A question for Senator McCain, although others may want to comment. Mr. Inkster pointed out ISIL's roots in the Ba'ath Party, and it's no more than stating an obvious fact that if Saddam Hussein, malign as he was still in power today, there would be no ISIL, at least not in its present form. And I wonder if that causes you to reflect on the war in Iraq, on the overthrow of Saddam, and the way in which such acts can have unintended and unforeseen consequences.
Right, well, we'll stop there while more of you ponder about any questions you might have. And I think, if I may, I'll start with the Senator and move from left to right. 2 or 3 were directly focused on you, Senator, but I'm very happy for all of you to comment on anything that's been said. And Nigel, you had a couple of specific questions as well. So,
well, let me begin to respond to Lloyd Parry. I think that you could make an argument about whether we should have gone to war in Iraq, and I think it is a legitimate question. I think it's also a legitimate question that should be asked, is that once we had succeeded, and we did because of the surge, Al-Qaeda was done, should we have withdrawn all of our troops against the advice of every military leader that I know, and as we predicted, I predicted, and others did, that if we withdrew every one of our troops, that we would then see the situation that evolved today. I repeat, we had it won, and I'd be glad to show you that the casualties were down, Al-Qaeda was done. So it's a legitimate question. And no, I don't think the Iraqi people would have been better off under Saddam Hussein. The person who, after the initial Iraqi invasion, fast and furious, it went from village to village, destroying and killing anyone who stood in the way of his military. But the point is that at great cost of hundreds of thousands of American lives, killed and wounded, we had succeeded. And those are facts. People don't want to admit that, but they're facts. So all I can say is that at great cost of American blood and treasure, decided to leave in a, quote, democratic, free, and prosperous Iraq, and the consequences were predictable. Now, I'll add one more point. If we carry out the same withdrawal plan for Afghanistan, which is in train right now, you will see the same movie again. You will see it again, because we must have a residual force behind there, or Afghanistan will descend into chaos. On the question about ground troops, yes, we need ground troops. Yes, we need ground troops. American public opinion, there was a recent poll, showed 73% of the American people think we need some ground troops in order to reverse the situation. Americans watching on television and on the internet, Americans being beheaded, had a profound effect on American public opinion. None of us are advocating a return of massive numbers of forces. We are advocating forward air controllers, special forces, logistics, intelligence, and other people, and we're talking about 10,000. Right now, 75% of the sorties, the combat missions flown in Iraq and Syria, return to base without dropping a weapon. 75%. You as a military man know full well that you have to be able to identify targets. And without forward air controllers on the ground, you can't identify targets. So what lessons have we learned about the global terrorist war? There are many, but I would say that one of them is that first you have to defeat them, and you have to defeat them militarily. And all the other aspects of defeating ISIL follows in train. Economics, education, communication. One of the previous questions was about communications. And when terrorist organizations succeed, they attract young people from all over the world, especially to Europe. Our director of our FBI has said that young Americans and young Europeans who have gone to fight in Iraq and Syria will be returning, and they will be intent on attacking the United States of America and our allies. Mr. Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, spent 4 years in our prison camp called Camp Bucca in Iraq. The day he left, Mr. Baghdadi said, "I'll see you in New York." I don't think Mr. Baghdadi was a humorist. And so the fact is that we are not winning, and every day we're not, they are recruiting young people, particularly young men, from everywhere in the world to their banner, who are flowing into Iraq and Syria at a greater rate than we're killing them. So yes, we need airstrikes, and we need additional troops on the ground, and we need to use the advantages that we have in a broad variety of ways militarily. Right now, that is not happening. Finally, again, the communications battle, which plagues all of us, the use of the internet, the recruitment of the internet. Young persons right here in Singapore were recently arrested who were recruited. So that recruiting effort is going on all over the world. We have to counter it in the same way that it is conveyed, and that's the use of the internet. But we also have to have Muslim clerics stand up and condemn this radical and evil interpretation of the Koran. And it has to be condemned for what it is, and Muslim clerics and Muslim leaders throughout the world have to lead in that. Finally, I would remind everybody what we all know, and that is Indonesia is the largest Muslim country on earth, and there is active recruitment taking place there as well as other Muslim countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colonel Liu?
Yes. Maybe I want to respond also the debate on the losing of the battle of strategic communications and others. I think it's also an issue relevant to the standard. As I also mentioned in my presentation, that the unified standard will facilitate the international cooperation, including the cooperation on communication and other things, even it's very difficult. And I also want to raise your attention to one of the root causes, we call it poverty. And I still remember one of the propagandas of the ISIS for the young people is that, yes, you are a loser. You are a loser not because you are, but because the society, the government, and your country make you a loser. So we also call ISIS a loser's island alliance. So that's another point I want to raise your attention to give a comprehensive approach to increasing stability and average life standard of some countries. Thank you.
On this business of communications, I often think that whereas in the past military men would use the media or whatever means of communication available to explain what they've just done militarily, today we have to look at what we want to say and communicate and design our tactics to reflect that message. A complete 180 degrees reversal on what we have historically done. It's just food for thought, and sometimes I'm sure I'm right, and we consistently fail to do that. If I may, Tom, next.
Thank you, David. Three brief points. Regarding ground troops, and I think we're talking Iraq because Syria is so complicated as to warn against that right now. But if we're talking Iraq, certainly we need to be aware that many nations have ground troops on the ground, but they're there in an advise and assist role. I think what we're talking about here is to allow them or give them the mandate to accompany or partake in combat. And I have great concerns as one of the chiefs of defense there. First of all, we haven't been invited to do so in Iraq. While it's true that the airlines of operation really are there and having difficulty because there's very little linkage to forward air control or to intel, this is a holding action while we're building partner capacity. Prime Minister Abadi certainly has not invited us in any way to do so. How should forces, I think Mr. Gong mentioned how should forces adapt. I would just add to that, it's a bifurcated problem, isn't it? At home, they have to adapt in one way because they have to adapt in such a way as to intervene while protecting civil rights, while away they need to develop their tactics in a place that's usually ungoverned spaces without civil rights, certainly compassion to the people on the ground, but without civil rights so much. And my last point would be on losing the comms battle. It's a very different comms battle. Towards the end of the Afghan conflict, NATO was getting fairly good at getting a different message across to the townspeople in the towns across Afghanistan, but that's not what we're talking about here. When we try to play the comms game, you first of all have to figure out what group ISIS message appeals to, and in most cases I think what we see is the disconnected, the isolated, the adventure seekers. Therefore, you kind of have three ways to deal with it. One is to develop a message that's more attractive to that group, and that could be very tough. The second might be to block the message, and that's very tough. The third would be to monitor who's resonating with those messages and to watch their reactions and interdict, as seen here, as the Senator mentioned in Singapore over the last couple of weeks. Thank you, David.
Nigel, and you had a couple of specific questions.
Yeah, well, I mean, one in specifically about Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. And, it's certainly the case that since the eruption of Islamic State last year, Al-Qaeda has been trading at quite a significant discount. The organization is down, but it's not yet out. Where is Al-Qaeda leadership concentrated? Well, operationally, it's Yemen, but there Al-Qaeda is actually quite beleaguered, engaging in quite serious war fighting. But the rest of it is, of course, in the Indian subcontinent, in the Afghan-Pakistan border region. It was interesting that Al-Qaeda leadership response to the arrival of Islamic State as this new phenomenon was to declare first thing, the existence of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. Relatively speaking, I think Al-Qaeda are quite well placed here. And this brings me to the whole question. This brings me actually rather neatly to the question that was raised about, what can we learn about the experience of the last 10 plus years of global war on terror, call it what you will. And I think these two things come together quite neatly, because we don't really know what's going to happen in Afghanistan or indeed Pakistan after the NATO ISAF drawdown is completed. It's anybody's guess, how
Anybody's guess?
Yeah, how extremism will actually play out there. Yeah, but I mean, my point is, for the last decade, we've had a global counterterrorism model, which in practice consists of the United States sitting like a spider at the center of the web and acting as a kind of collector of first resort and coordinator to a bunch of other organizations, militaries, intelligence services, who to varying degrees are willing, coerced, or partners in this enterprise. I do not think that that model will be sustainable with a phenomenon as variegated and confederated as Islamic State potentially could be. And what does that mean? It means I think that we somehow have to expect to institutionalize the reality of the approach espoused by President Obama, which is to rely more on partners and allies and to kind of step back from being in control. And what that means in respect of Afghanistan is that we've kind of got to work out how to have a grown-up relationship with countries like China, like Russia, like Iran, who potentially can play a very significant role in helping to stabilize Afghanistan and deal with the still very real threat that I agree it potentially could pose. This is going to be a challenge, but somehow I think we've got to find our way there.
Chairman's prerogative again, I agree with the last bit about working with China and Russia and even Iran, i.e. states need to get their act together against the bigger threat. But I'm 150% with the Senator on you might as well lock in success where you've at least got it, which is the risk of our early drawdown in Afghanistan, which I think is tragic if our countries don't at least continue to support a democratically elected government in which 8 million Afghans defied the Taliban to bravely vote in the way they did. And it will be a shame on us all if we ignore those Afghans and after all they've been through and after all we've been through. But I don't think Nigel was saying that either. No. Knud, finally, anything you would like to say on any of those points?
Very quickly, I would like to come back to a couple of points. The one is the command and control at the political and military level. It is already difficult at the national level to gather together all the strands of a state power to combat terrorists of one kind or another. And needless to say, it becomes all the more difficult when it is done multinationally. But it is possible, even though it has been very difficult. NATO has done it and does it. The European Union has done it and do it. My point here that when we are addressing the issue of Daesh, or shall we say a configuration like Daesh, an organization like Daesh, the possibilities are there if we choose to use them. And that, of course, is a point which has been raised by Senator McCain, and it's not for me to comment on that, but the decision has to be made. But the tools are available, be they international, multinational, and national. The other point I would like to come back to is, and maybe which relates strongly to the title of this panel debate, which is the adaptation of the armed forces. And there I think it has already been raised that we need to look at two different dimensions which eventually link up. The first dimension is that from a national perspective in most countries, if not all countries, the first actions will be by the police, national security, etc., and the armed forces with very selected forces might be used to conduct very specific operations and support, etc. True, and that's probably true in most, if not all, countries. But if we move into a multinational configuration, as we saw it in one way or another in certain parts of the Iraqi campaign and definitely in parts of the Afghan campaign, and which we might see in the future in one way or another, then it becomes a different issue. And then we come back to this that General David Richard mentioned about the deployability and the availability of forces and so on. And therefore, I come back to what I said. If our armed forces are not able to address the full spectrum of operations and can adapt at very short notice and are deployable, they will not be able to live up to the task which is put to them. My final point is the issue of strategic communication and are we losing the information battle? Well, the first point I would raise here is, do we understand the threat we are facing? If we take what has been discussed here in this panel, I would say when we talk about Daesh and its recruiting, we are already getting, shall we say, a reasonable picture of what needs to be done. And the second point, which implies, again, the use of active involvement of the press, which chooses its own ways, at least in quite a number of nations, of education systems, of religious leaders and so on, is to pass out a message which contradicts the one which Daesh uses. and which of course also means that we have to prove to a certain extent that what Daesh offers, violence of an extreme character and so on, and destruction, is not something which promotes anything. And finally, my final remark is, which I have noticed of all the interventions here, nobody mentioned, maybe because it's not explicit in the title of the discussion, but why do people become terrorists? And well, it was alluded by General Tom Lawson. When you are disenfranchised and you have been over decades by bad governance, what do you want to choose? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Knud. I've got two more requests to speak. You're very lucky, JJ, that I'm going to call on you because you haven't got your plaque, but as you're relatively new to IISS, I'll forgive you.
Yes, I thought he hadn't. Thank you very much, David. Yes, I'm not deliberately incognito. I just forgot my nameplate. My name is John Jenkins. I'm the Middle East Director for IISS. And have been since January. Before that, I was ambassador in Saudi Arabia. I was ambassador in Iraq for 2 years. I was so happy about what was happening in Iraq, I decided to go to Libya during the revolution. I was ambassador to Syria. I was consul general in Jerusalem when Hamas won the 2006 legislative elections, while continuing a campaign of assassinations and bombings. So I've had experience of this from close up. Just going back to the basics of this, I mean, Nigel's point about the distinction between Al-Qaeda and Daesh is right. But Daesh, of course, built on Al-Qaeda. The difference between Al-Qaeda and Daesh, Al-Qaeda sought to colonize existing states. And it didn't actually call for the establishment of a global caliphate. In some of its utterances, it actually said this was premature, which was a classic form of sacralized Islamism ideology, which went back to the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1920s. So there was a cascade and metastasizing effect in these ideologies. So it goes back well before the fall of Saddam. Al-Qaeda, of course, arose in the late 1980s elsewhere, which had nothing to do with Western occupation of Arab lands. It had very little to do, actually, with Palestine. Al-Qaeda originally said very little about Palestine. It was a much more, in Nigel's terms, eschatological and millenarian cult, but with very practical, immediate aims. What Daesh does is claim two sorts of authority, which are very distinct. One is political, and one is religious and ideological. But both of them are global. And what they seek to do is destroy not just existing states, but boundaries between states. This is what we see in Syria, and this is what we see in Iraq. This, it seems to me, is profoundly dangerous to the existing state system in the Middle East. And it depends what we think about the state system in the Middle East. Personally, I think if you want to have any form of globalized governance of global issues and indeed of interstate issues, you have to have a state system. If you have states that fail and states that cease to exist, we all have a massive problem. So I think the first thing you need to do when you're thinking about what you do about Daesh in the Middle East is sustain the state system. The only bit of the state system in the Middle East that works properly at the moment is the Gulf. Most other bits, Egypt perhaps a little, Jordan, Morocco, but the rest of it looks very bad. The first thing you do is sustain states. And it seems to me that the theatre in which you sustain states, there are two theatres at the moment in the Middle East. One is Yemen and one is Iraq. I think Syria is just very difficult. I think you have to start with Iraq before you can fix Syria. And I think what we, as a global community, and what Western states in particular can do is address the material and political threat. The ideational issue, the claim to ideational and religious authority by Daesh is different, and I'll come to that in a minute. But the way you push back the material and political threat is by destroying Daesh on the ground. As the Senator said, by end of 2008, 2009, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or the Islamic State in Iraq, was reduced to a rump with no money. We knew it wasn't getting any money, it was fading, and then it came back. And I think the mistake, personally, wasn't so much the failure to keep troops in Iraq. It was the belief you could hand over responsibility for dealing with all this to Maliki. It was a political failure more than anything else, and we were all participants in this. But you can destroy Daesh, I think, in Iraq. And I think if you think about what the Gulf states are doing in Yemen, whatever you think about the Yemen campaign, it does show a willingness to mobilise some sort of coalition. I think one of the problems with this, if you think about what Daesh do, Daesh are good at ops, but they're also good at logistics, planning, intelligence. So are Hezbollah. Our opponents, the opponents of formed militaries in the Middle East, are much more competent militarily than most of the formed militaries. So what you need to do is accept the offer of certain states to commit their troops to this, but fill in the functions that they don't have, which, as the Senator said, are logistics, are intelligence, are planning, are targeting, dynamic targeting. And that, it seems to me, is actually eminently doable if you have the will, because what essentially Yemen has shown is that these states are prepared to offer their forces. This isn't about a ground invasion, which is the way it's sometimes put, and it's certainly not about wanting to do this more than the people themselves on the ground want to do it. The problem with Iraq is that actually most Iraqis do want this to be done, but they can't agree among themselves that this needs to be done. And that, it seems to me, is an opening for others, the United States with other allies, to fill in these gaps. The ideational threat, which is essentially a claim to overwhelming religious authority, is something I think that only Muslims can solve. This has to come from within the Muslim world. And this is a process, this collapse in authority and religious authority, that goes back at least to the 1960s and probably before. And that is going to take a very long time. And that, it seems to me, is a genuinely generational. I think it's 30 years, maybe more. In the meantime, what you need to do is produce examples of successful states. And it's very interesting. There's an estimate of 20,000 foreign fighters with Daesh at the moment in Syria and Iraq. If you assume there's 20,000 people who want actively to fight with them, and there's now maybe 5% across the Middle East who sympathise with Daesh, that still leaves a huge number of people, a huge number of Muslims in the Middle East, who do not want anything to do with this. And if you look at surveys of Arab youth, you will find the one country that most Arab youth want their country to be like, or they want to go and work in, is the United Arab Emirates, that Babylon of modernity in the Middle East. And I think this is significant. Make material success, and other things will follow. And that gives a platform for countries like Saudi Arabia, which consistently gets blamed for being the harbour of Daesh ideologies, which I don't think it is. I think it's much more complex than that. And other countries to modernise at their own pace. But I do think it's going to take 30 years. In the meantime, what we need to do, I think collectively, is improve our intelligence collection. Because in the end, most of this, in terms of managing security threats to us, in the West and the UK and the United States, is going to be about intelligence. And I think we need to do more of that. If you look what's happening in Saudi Arabia in the last 2 weeks, 2 suicide attacks on Shia mosques in the eastern province. Neither of them did the Mabahith, the domestic intelligence agency in Saudi Arabia, which is highly effective, neither of them did they see coming. And it seems to me that's a massive red flag for them and for us. Intelligence. Thank you.
Well, we'll come back to any points. I'm sure the Senator was largely nodding, metaphorically, at a lot of what you just heard. And you can also see why John Chipman worked very hard to get JJ, as we all know and love him, into IISS. Thank you very much, JJ. I've got one... I can't see your name from this distance, so if you'd like to tell us who you are, and over to you, please, sir.
Fen Hampson from Canada. I have a question as opposed to an extended comment. The question, and I'd put it to Senator McCain, but perhaps others would like to reflect on it as well. What is it going to take to change the current approach? I wouldn't use the term strategy because I don't think there is one. And if we have to wait 18 months until there's a new incumbent in the White House, what's the problem going to look like in 18 months and perhaps even longer, because a new president will take some time to develop a new approach or strategy? And you've alluded to things getting worse, but will they be so bad that ISIL will be undefeatable?
An excellent question. Have I got any others before I ask the panel to make their concluding remarks? Yes, Fleur, please.
Thanks, David. It's just an observation. First of all, I've been quite intrigued by the very sharp division of in ideas about how you treat this malaise between the intelligence elements and the soldiers on display. And that's not to suggest that the soldiers don't have intelligence, but nevertheless there's quite a difference in approach. It's just the concentration on ISIL, and I can understand why we concentrate on ISIL, because it's got the biggest profile. But it does ignore the fact that this particular infection is not restricted to ISIL. Elements, imitations, affiliates have sprung up right throughout North Africa. And in Africa south of the Sahara. Can we talk about ISIL in isolation simply because it manifests itself in two states in the Middle East, and forget about Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and the suggestion that was made by the Malaysian Defense Minister this morning that in fact ISIL itself, or something similar to ISIL, is not only attracting recruits from this region to fight in Iraq or in Syria, but is actually seeding colonies in ungovernable areas of Southeast Asia. In other words, one has if the heart of ISIL is in Syria and in Iraq, it is establishing mini caliphates in parts of this region. And because the problem seems to be too big for us to grasp, even in its simplified state, which is Syria and Iraq, we fail to look at the spread, which is potentially as something we can't even bear to contemplate. It's beyond our ken until it thrusts itself into centre stage.
Okay, well, that's an excellent thought. I don't think probably we meant to ignore the wider issue. Interestingly, I was a moderator at a conference held in the Gulf, well, in actually the Middle East recently, which was addressing how a strategy could be created that started in some respects on ISIL, and actually they were both most interested in Yemen, and then might be used as a model and be linked together to address what's going on in Nigeria and then more widely. So people are thinking about it, and I suspect we rather got drawn into ISIL, but I think it's a very important point to make. Right, well, if there's no more, I'm going to ask Senator McCain again to start, because there was a question raised by Phil Henderson specifically about how long do we have, which is a bit of a theme, as you realise I've got, and then we'll spread it down the line again, starting after the Senator with you, Colonel Lee. Senator, please.
Well, thank you. And General Lawson, if you don't want any more troops on the ground for forward air controls or intelligence, or perhaps to launch raids such as recently into Syria, where we were able to kill the number 2 person there for ISIS, then you must be satisfied with the status quo. I am not satisfied with the status quo. We are not winning. And you made reference to the, quote, end of the conflict, Afghan conflict. General, the Afghan conflict is a long way from the end. It may be that Canada won't be in Afghanistan, but I can guarantee you that the Taliban will be, and many other elements as well. We always say we want to rely on the Allies. They have to do it themselves. And that's very convenient, particularly back home when Americans are as weary as anybody. But there is only, right now in this world, no substitute for the kind of leadership and capabilities that Americans can provide. Somebody made reference with working with Russia. Working with Russia. Working with Russia. As we speak, Vladimir Putin is massing his troops in eastern Ukraine for another move. Who has dismembered a European country for the first time in 70 years. Destruction of the liberal world order that was established at the end of World War II. As far as we have focus only on Iraq and Syria as far as ISIS is concerned, I'm sorry to tell you that's not true. Terrorist organizations all over Africa, all over the Middle East, are declaring their allegiance to ISIS. They want to become part of ISIS because ISIS is succeeding. I would ask you to look at a map of the Middle East in January of 2009 and look at a map today. I think you would find that it's dramatically changed, including Libya, including Yemen, including as well Iraq and Syria, and problems obviously in Egypt, and I won't go down the list. As far as Yemen is concerned, the Saudis, without consulting the United States, launched air attacks in Yemen. I asked the head of Central Command, when were you told that the Saudis were going to launch airstrikes in Yemen? 1 hour before. The ambassador to UAE, recently in a meeting that we had with the Senate Armed Services Committee, said, we think it might be better to be an enemy of the United States than a friend. Because they now watch Iran on the move in 4 countries, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. And they see the Iranians succeeding. They see the Iranians now with the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, Qasem Soleimani, taking selfies outside of Tikrit. The same Shiite militia that we fought against and lost many Americans' lives is now going to be leading the effort to retake Ramadi. And Shiite militia will not mix well with Sunni inhabitants of Ramadi. In fact, after Tikrit, there's ample evidence that these same Shiite militias carried out significant war crimes, killing, murdering, torturing, etc. So Iran is on the move, and Iran is successful, and that has got the Saudis, UAE, Qatar, and even Turkey deeply disturbed. I agree with much of what Ambassador Jenkins said. I think he's very thoughtful, and benefit of his experience is very important. But I also would say that we should understand that, and I won't respond to a lot of the others, but what Mr. Hampson said, what has got to change? We have to understand the nature of the enemy. We have to understand the threat. We have to develop a strategy in both Iraq and Syria. To just say, well, we're going to ignore Syria while we try to do something in Iraq, it makes no difference to ISIS whether they are in Iraq or Syria. And if we are not going to have forward air controllers on the ground, we are not going to be able to identify anything but static targets. That's just a fundamental of warfare. The way we're carrying out our air campaign today reminds me of a war long ago and far away in Vietnam, because we were restricted to such a degree as to what the targets that we could strike. So I guess in summary, we have a major challenge, And we ought to recognize it, and we ought to recognize that it isn't confined to the Middle East, because their object, as described by Mr. Baghdadi, as described by ISIS at every turn. I was featured in one of their recent online periodicals. I was pleased to see the Crusader McCain, I am called by them. Their object is to destroy us, and their object is to send young men and possibly young women back to Europe, back to the United States, where all they need is a plane ticket, and to carry out attacks on the United States of America and Europe. And that is the opinion of our intelligence chiefs as well as the director of the FBI. And I don't think we ought to disregard their assumptions. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And then briefly, please, the rest of you, quick summary points.
Very quick conclusion. Yes, for combating the international terrorism, every country in the international society has to do more. China will do more. I can give example in this field. In April 2014, China proposed to establish the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Counterterrorism Center. And this proposal has been supported by all SCO member states, including Russia, working with Russia again. And China will continue to help Syria, Iraq, and other countries to enhance counterterrorism capabilities. I think China, in this point, China will do more. For UN Secretary General Mr. Ben stressed that the year of 2015 should be that of global efforts to strike terrorism, and all countries should contribute more efforts to counter terrorism. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with, if I may, Knud, and we'll work down here, because you've got a little bit of a challenge to throw back at the Senator.
Thank you. Very quickly. The armed forces in general can contribute in one way or another, be it nationally or multinationally, where there is a necessity to counter physically by military power terrorists. But two things have to be kept in mind, seen from my perspective. The first one is they can never stand alone. They will have to be working alongside the other dimensions of power. And this is based upon what I think has been not really touched upon, and which I already mentioned once, and that is we are speaking about profoundly disenfranchised populations. And as long as bad governance and other things are not really addressed, and I think Iraq is a very good example of that, then we are not going to go anywhere.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, when you're confronted with a raging fire, your first objective is to put it out, and you worry about developing a sophisticated fire alarm system afterwards. But at the root of the problem in Iraq and the enablement of IIS is through some toxic sectarian politics, and unless and until those are addressed, we're not going to get very far. I wish I could believe that it would be possible for the United States to resume its global leadership role in respect of dealing with the phenomenon that we face. Having sort of lived through it over the last decade, it was a bit of a bumpy ride, occasionally subjected us to a degree more moral hazard than we were comfortable with, but it did the job and it worked. I'm just not sure that it's going to be possible to do it this time. I always used to tell my junior officers when I was in the intelligence service that what we needed to be able to do in the world of intelligence was to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds. And I think this is something we're going to have to learn to do in respect of this particular problem. So, whilst we're beating Russia over the head about Ukraine, and we certainly should, because I don't from one moment purport to justify what they're doing there. If we think that one future area of IIS expansion is former Soviet Central Asia, and I firmly believe that it is, who is going to be able to fix that? Not us, Russia.
Thanks, David. I think we should probably be a little careful with saying, Mr. Hampson, that there is no strategy. I think that American leadership under American leadership, there was a strategy developed. What you may say is that you're impatient with it because it's not working quickly. But this, I think we should recognize, has 5 lines of effort, most of which are aimed at good government. As Ambassador Jenkins was talking about, one of the lines is to cut off financing. And only one of those lines is military, and it includes building partner capacity. Certainly, Senator, I'm all for forward air control parties. You and I have both flown many close air support missions in slightly different generations. But I think that forward air control is something that can be taught to our Iraqi security forces partners. I think what we've got right now that's fundamentally dissatisfying to Westerners is that there's a holding action. That air power is a holding action as we wait for Iraqi security forces to reach a fighting level that we hope they will reach, that will then put pressure on ISIS within the country. Is that something that will destroy ISIS? I think you have to define what destroy means. The ideology, we've heard, could be a 30-year destruction, taking out their ability to carry out large military maneuvers that threaten innocents in Iraq and later in Syria. Maybe so. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. Knud had to go to a bilat, so I let him go. May I thank the panel on your behalf, and just to prove, Fleur, that all military men don't think quite the same way, as far as the luxury of time is concerned, implied by Tom Lawson's answer then about building capacity, I'm firmly in the Senator's camp. I don't think we have that much time. It doesn't seem to be working too well to me. But otherwise, I think there is a broad congruence of view. We've just emphasised different bits of it. And I'd like to leave in great harmony between all of us, civilian, military and politician alike. Thank you all very much indeed.